Welcome back to Cosmic Voyage. Today, we dive into something that can no longer be ignored. The American empire is in decline, slowly but undeniably. Joined by Professor Richard Wolff, we unpack how the U.S. economy isn't just fragile, it's filled with illusions of strength. As its foundation crumbles, violence becomes the tool to hold it together. And then there's Israel, a 21st century settler colony in a world that has moved past colonialism. Why is the U.S. still backing it? Because, perhaps, it sees its own reflection, a desperate project trying to preserve control in a world that's changing fast. But what's even more painful is what's happening at home. People have lost their jobs, their futures, their hope. Entire towns are boarded up. And who gets blamed? Not the corporations, not the CEOs, but immigrants, minorities, the scapegoats. Enter the demagogue. He tells the white male worker, "You've been betrayed by elites who favor women, people of color, and immigrants who steal your future." And it works. Blame the powerless. Never the employer who moved your job to Shanghai. Never the billionaire who bought your factory and shut it down. And as long as both parties, especially the Democrats, refuse to name the real enemy,
corporate America,
the demagogue will win.
this is not just about politics.
It's about the collapse of an empire, choosing the most destructive path down.
Iran, Russia, now China.
Each conflict a distraction, a way to rally support, while the foundation rots. And unless something changes, radically, this slow-motion disaster will only accelerate. Let's watch the video together.
Hi everyone and welcome. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Professor Richard Wolff, an economist and best-selling author, to discuss some of the economics of a declining empire. So welcome back to the program. So for some, this appears to be, entering the very violent endgame of an empire in decline, at least as we see when the economic foundations of the American empire is weakened. Many expected to see more violence, and I guess it hasn't disappointed. But how do you see, well, what is it usually that one would look for if you would assess the economics of a declining empire?
Is the effort made by the declining empire to postpone or delay its further decline, and to do so by impeding the rise of whatever's coming next, a multinational arrangement or a new empire or an ambiguous situation as to which of those two will emerge. And that, I think, is what you're seeing. In my judgment, Israel is like a spectacular example of something that is utterly anachronistic. It's a phenomena out of date, out of time. The last 150 years have been, if they've been anything, a period of anti-colonial transformation in which the majority of the world's people have struggled painfully and difficult, and it took a long time to undo the colonialization by Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And Israel is the outstanding remainder. Here we have a settler colonialism in the 21st century, after a century and a half of anti-colonialism, trying to establish and to expand a settler colonialism. And it finds the whole world organized against it, which should have brought them to the idea, why would we be doing something that the whole world votes against in every United Nations vote it has ever taken, not to speak of all the other ways? And why would the United States line itself up with this small country doing something so or anti-historical? Well, the suggestion is they have something in common. And I think they do, that the United States sees in Israel its own project.
Well, you mentioned on the topic of Iran, I guess that's also a good indication of a struggling empire that is the scapegoating. Once the good times appear to be behind and there's a decline, then one usually goes look for who has robbed the empire of its greatness. So it can be internal, some minorities or whatever it might be, but it's also often external powers. So I guess the external would be obvious here. That is, as Trump would say, China, who has come and taken our jobs. But in the combination of increased militarism, this is also problematic. The U.S. now is fighting a war indirectly, though, against Russia, but now I think it would probably prefer to fight indirectly with Iran, but given that Israel is a much weaker proxy or compared to fighting a larger Iran, then Ukraine would be with, it's 35 million people, which you can draw on their human resources. The US appears to get much more directly involved in the fight against Iran. But, you can probably add more countries coming on this list besides Russia, Iran. They're also talking now openly about a war with China. Is this, do you see a unlikely, a graceful decline of empire here that is to walk away from it, reduce the empire to save the republic, or do you see the US going fully into this in terms of trying to knock out rising adversaries, regional adversaries at least?
In this situation, the demagogic politician, e.g., Mr. Trump and others like him, see correctly a wonderful opportunity. There's an enormous part of the population that is very, very angry, very bitter, very hostile, very full of the rage of a destroyed circuit. They can't make a living. Their children have prospects of nothing. Their community, half the stores in the city are boarded up because they are defunct. The government of the state has no money and therefore cannot and does not help them, etc. And meanwhile, over the last 15, 20 years, or 30 even, we have had two interesting movements. The movement of black and brown people who don't want to be second-class citizens, as they have always been, and the women who don't want to be second-class citizens, as they have always been. And so the demagogue puts these elements together, very creative. He goes to the white male factory worker and says, you're the victim of what those elite politicians, Democrats mostly, have been doing, pandering to women, pandering to black and brown people by giving them preferences like the diversity movement, etc., etc. And their worst crime is bringing in the immigrants to vote for them so they can continue to favor everyone else at your expense. This was a genius. You got to take your head off, because if you're going to do a political analysis, this is the way to do it. And in he comes Mr. Trump, and what does he do? He mixes together Christian fundamentalism, That's who these white men are. White supremacy, that's what's lurking in the background of that population anyway. And focus it against people who can't vote against him, immigrants. They don't have the vote. The only people he can't win over on this system are the women, and they voted against him in the last election relative to other groups. That's our situation, and the demonization and the scapegoating of the immigrant is completely crazy unless you understand what its function is. I mean, the United States is an economy of 330 million people. Undocumented immigrants here are 10, maybe 12 million. That's all. And they work very hard. Their crime rate is less than that of native-born American. They don't fit the stereotype at all. They haven't got the power. They couldn't possibly explain America's difficulty. But they are useful. Why? Because they speak to the suffering of those white, male, unionized factory workers and carefully avoid any blame whatsoever on the employer class. They never say that the reason your job left Ohio and moved to Shanghai is because the employer decided to do that. No, instead we have a vague articulation. The Chinese took the job. No, they didn't. It's very clear how the job went to China. It's very clear that if you lost your job to a machine, it's because your employer made that substitution. And it's very clear that employers encouraged the immigrants to come because they would work in poorer conditions and for less money than you would. And the workers know everything I just said. But their suffering is so great. And the absence of the Democratic Party willing to say what I just said, other than Mr. Sanders, he gets close. But other than him, they don't see no one. So they have to turn to the scapegoat they've got, which is the Democrats who are linked to the immigrants to support their votes to hurt us. And as long as he can do that, and as long as the Democratic Party is equally committed not to blame corporate America at all for anything, then they will lose. And Mr. Trump or whoever comes next will win. And at this point, if you ask me, then I think this right wing will continue to win. And what they just did to Iran will not be sufficient to undo this. There will have to be more horrible events, or it's not going to change.
So, what are we left with? A crumbling economic foundation, rising authoritarianism, and a population pushed to blame everyone but the real architects of their suffering. Empires don't fall quietly. They thrash, they scapegoat, they project their decline outward through militarism, propaganda, and cultural division. And unless the root causes, corporate power, economic inequality, and political cowardice, are confronted head-on, the slide will continue. But awareness is the first step. As we've heard today, clarity matters. History matters. And speaking truth, even when uncomfortable, may just be the start of something different. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware,